Welcome everyone. We are live today on this wonderful Saturday morning. I'm here with Caitlin Long, who's the co-founder of the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition. You would have seen videos with her before. She's just such an amazing force of nature who's really paving the way for what regulation should look like in the United States. I know that this is an ongoing battle, and different places like New York, for example, have just done a terrible job at really stifling anything crypto related there, any kind of blockchain tech, just by setting up terrible laws there. Whereas you compare that to Wyoming and the work that Caitlin is doing, and what they're doing is just amazing. I wanted to have Caitlin on the show today because there are a bunch of bills that have just been passed, and I want to talk about them to let you know what is going on. Like, if you're involved in blockchain, if you have a company, you're looking for a place to incorporate, it seems like Wyoming is the place, and we're going to walk you through exactly why that is and what the consequences of some of these bills are. So welcome to the show, Caitlin. It's always so wonderful to have you on.
Oh, thank you, Naomi. It's always so wonderful to be on with you. And we've taped some shows together in happier circumstances for you. I see you're back in your home, and it sounds like the one room that wasn't damaged by the flood.
Yeah, everything is just like, I can't spend too long here. There's no heating. There's like minimal electricity. There's nothing. So I just come back here to check on everything. But I'll update everyone. I'm going to make a video and update people on what actually happened, because I've had a lot of people asking me about it. I just got to work up the courage to talk about it. But let's talk about something a lot more exciting. So I mentioned on the show yesterday, on my weekly crypto recap show, that there was all of this breaking news with bills that just got passed in Wyoming. And yesterday you just tweeted out again. There were, I think 3 more that went through. So let's start at the top. Let's talk about this first one. I haven't got them pulled up, so I don't have the names of them. But let's talk about the one that clearly designates property rights, talks about rehypothecation and the consequences of that. And let's talk about what rehypothecation is for people who have no idea, never heard this term before. So let's start from there.
Sure. Well, that is our signature bill, and it is the one that has been the most labor of love. It was literally months in the making, and there was at least one all-nighter along the way with my legislative attorney pal, who is the true unsung hero of all this. We also were working on this on Christmas Day. So this was just a massive heavy lift, and I salute him for being such an effective partner on this and doing amazing research. But what we did is actually really simple in concept, which is we just said, if you own crypto assets that are valuable, they are property. And if they're property, that means a couple of things. It means if someone steals them, that it's a crime. It means that if you own them outright, you can have and should have your property rights recognized in those valuable assets. And it also means that we now have rules for negotiability for those. This is where the lawyers will geek out, but the foundation of business is actually commercial law, and commercial law describes how you transact business legally. And we now have a framework for doing that. From that stems a couple of other things, one of which is if people want to use their crypto assets as collateral for a loan, we've given a roadmap for lenders to be able to what's called perfect a security interest in that asset. And therefore, it makes those assets, again, more valuable, more negotiable, because now you can use them as collateral for a loan, for fiat cash against your crypto. And as we all know, for better or for worse, that's happening in spades right now.
Yeah.
And then also it lends to another impact, which is if you cannot own your own coins. And again, I would not recommend this for individuals. I'm a big proof of keys person. But for institutional investors, by law, they're not allowed to self-custody their own assets. So in your 401k
what do you mean by self-custody their own assets?
So self-custody your assets is holding your own private key. That's going to be the self-custody of digital assets across the board. And we all know the technology allows us to do that. But what was crazy about the legal discussion is that the legal community had gone off on a different direction, which said that you only got property rights in your digital assets if you owned them through a securities intermediary.
So that, I mean, let's talk about why that was the case. So that's a holdover from traditional finance where everything is so obfuscated and opaque, and they throw in all these layers of complexity so that you basically need to have these intermediaries to hold your assets, to hold your securities, to do all of this for you. They become like brokers of your assets.
That's
and
right.
And by law, that's a requirement there. And what they were trying to do is say, listen, we want this to apply to cryptocurrency as well. Whereas anyone who uses cryptocurrency understands that you can hold your own asset. Like, it's really easy. You don't need these layers of complexity. So what you've done, Caitlin, is you basically fought the establishment here and you've won.
Well, it's interesting. I wouldn't necessarily say that. There was part of the establishment that clearly was moving in this direction, but we had some of the top law firms in the country helping us. Milbank Tweed, Debevoise and Plimpton came in with an unsolicited letter complimenting us on how well it was drafted and suggesting some refinements that we ended up putting through in an amendment at the 11th hour. So, those are big, very well-respected law firms. We had a Columbia law professor, a Cardozo law professor. Early on, Sullivan and Cromwell was helping us. These are very well-respected firms that some folks would say are part of the establishment, and yet they were absolutely helping us with the direction that we were going in. But your general conclusion is right, which is that there was a big push from, I suspect it was the securities industry, to pigeonhole digital assets into that same indirect ownership regime where you become a debtor-creditor relationship as opposed to a direct property owner. And you have to own your digital assets through a broker-dealer in order for them to be recognized as negotiable under commercial law, and in order for lenders to be able to lend against them. And that's just wrong. It's just wrong. It's not the way the technology works, and it's not the right outcome from a legal perspective. And
it was really like a prime example of regulatory capture there, where people wanted to implement these laws that basically safeguarded their industry and said, like, oh, well, people have to go through us. It's required by law for them to use our services. And it seems that, a lot of people in Wyoming, they thought, oh, they were kind of captured by this idea, and it was explained to them a way where they were like, oh, it makes sense, it's complicated, you should have these things. But then your group came in and explained to people exactly what this meant. And people immediately just got it, and they were like, oh, of course, like, if you can hold your own assets, why? Oh, like, it's ridiculous to mandate that someone else be an intermediary if it's not required. So
that's right.
Yeah, so that's just amazing what you guys did, and it ended up being passed almost unanimously. There was like one dissenting vote. Is that right?
Well, in the House, actually, you know what? It's so funny. They're all running together. I don't remember what the vote count was in the Senate. Yeah, that's right. It was one dissenting vote in the Senate, and I think there were 3 in the House. So it passed with very, very, very high margins, and I think it fits with the ethos of Wyoming. That's a place where what's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours, and good fences make good neighbors, and we believe in personal responsibility, and those sorts of cultural traits match up very well with the idea of owning your own assets and being your own bank and controlling your own destiny. And Wyoming was not about to sign on with the collectivist approach of let's pigeonhole digital assets into securities intermediaries. That would have been just an anathema to the culture of Wyoming, but also when I explain to folks, digital assets have no lender of last resort. So the games that get played on Wall Street, where we're playing 3-card Monte on a regular basis every day with people's livelihoods, and they get away with it for the most part. And then periodically we have these gigantic corrections, and everyone says they were not foreseeable, and no one could have anticipated.
Who could have possibly known that something bad was going to happen?
And of course they're 100% foreseeable. The only thing you don't know is the timing. But that would have been a disaster for digital assets, because we would have seen, and we will see, for digital asset companies that are subject to New York law, that want to rehypothecate your assets, that want to engage in failures to deliver, that want to operationally short your assets. Those New York crypto institutions that play fast and loose with your assets are going to go bust in the next boom bust cycle. They can last for years without revealing the fact that they're actually insolvent. But the next time there's a real run on those institutions, which is, I think, going to be in the next bear market, I do worry that, you know, the next bull bear run in this industry, which is probably going to happen over the next, you know, 5 to 8 years, in that next bear cycle, after having built up all this leverage in these New York institutions in the next bull cycle, that there are going to be some spectacular blowups. And again, I'm a big fan of proof of keys, not your coins.
Absolutely.
From an individual perspective, take your own responsibility. But for those institutional investors that have to have third-party custodians, I can say the Wyoming law is going to protect investors so much better than New York. And get out of New York if you're dealing with crypto.
Absolutely. So let's talk about rehypothecation as it applies to Wyoming, because it's a very important topic in Wyoming in particular. So let's talk about how it applies to crypto assets in general. So obviously, rehypothecation is the idea that if people give their assets to an institution, that, you know, banks can use that for their own purposes. And so let's talk about how that applies to Wyoming in particular.
Yeah, and it actually, to take it a step further, it's that if I post Bitcoin to you as collateral for a loan and you're an institution, then you can turn around and take my Bitcoin that I've posted as collateral and post it for a loan, for a second loan. Mm-hmm. And you wouldn't have to tell the second lender that that collateral was posted to you as a loan. So you actually have the same Bitcoin posted as collateral for 2 different loans. That's what rehypothecation is. And it turns out in securities, these so-called collateral chains can be many, many parties long. It's not just that it happens with 2 loans. It can happen with a dozen different loans against the same asset. And, mm-hmm. and the different lenders don't know that collateral has already been pledged for a different loan.
Right. Now, and then you end up with just like a fraction of the reserves needed if all these people actually wanted to call in and reclaim their assets. And yes, so like it's, you know, that's what causes bank runs. It's like, it's a huge deal.
Yep. Absolutely. And remember, there's no lender of last resort. So there's no way to paper over this if people actually do want the real thing. And as you say, take it, you know, a bank run starts and they withdraw their actual coins. You're going to see the quadra CXs type of situations occur a lot more frequently as more and more of this leverage gets built up in the system in New York institutions. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen in Wyoming. And
so why is it going to happen in Wyoming?
Yeah, well, two reasons. First of all, I was so happy when I was sitting down with the president of the Senate, walking him through the bill, asking him to sponsor it. And he said, oh, rehypothecation. He knew exactly what that was. And he's an attorney and an accountant, but he's not in the financial industry. But he knew exactly what it was. He said, did you know that's illegal in Wyoming? And I said, no, tell me about it. He knew about a Supreme Court case from 1986 where rehypothecation, where a criminal sentence for a felony conviction for rehypothecation was upheld by the Wyoming Supreme Court. Wow. And in this case, it was an industrial diamond that somebody had rehypothecated. But sure enough, there it is in the criminal statutes that if you rehypothecate, you take an asset that's already been pledged once for a loan and then take it to a different lender and pledge it again for a different loan. That is fraud. And if it's over $1,000 in the state of Wyoming, it's a felony. So I loved that. When I found that out, it just was, again, it fits so well with the ethos of this industry that, you know, not your coins, not your keys, not your coins. And, you know, it's okay for you to lend. I'm not opposed to lending. Right. Lending is actually a critical function of capital markets, mm-hmm. but it's the re-lending against the same collateral.
And also it's the transparency as well, not knowing. Yeah. Like, I mean, I think it's fine if you want to go to a bank and they give you a better rate because you know that they're fractional reserve, using fractional reserve, and they're going to, you know, it's not guaranteed you'll get your money back, but you're willing to take the risk because of the rewards. I think that's fine, but be transparent about it. Show how much you actually have in your reserves. And, you know, the whole banking industry industry is just such a cartel anyway. It's hard to have any sort of competition in that marketplace. It's just really difficult to open a financial institution. But that leads me on to one of the other bills that talks about financial institutions in Wyoming. So let's move on to there.
So we have a new special purpose depository institution in Wyoming. Again, the bills all have to be signed by Governor Gordon. So I'm optimistic, but it's not done until it's done. All I'm doing is reporting that it's through the legislature, which is by far the biggest hurdle. This one was controversial. It was a heavy lift to get this through. And we had significant opposition from the local banking industry all along. And they just didn't want a new type of banking charter coming into the state of Wyoming. But what this is a new type of banking charter. It's a 100% reserve requirement bank. And the reason it's 100% reserve requirement is because there's no FDIC insurance for this bank. And the reason that there is no FDIC insurance is because in our digging, the FDIC pretty clearly came out as the bad actor that's caused banks in the United States to not bank the blockchain industry.
Is that right? So you traced it back to FDIC. That's interesting.
It's not entirely the FDIC, but it's very clear. The FDIC had, beginning in 2013, so think about the timing, they started this project called Operation Choke Point. And it started with payday lenders, and then it expanded to firearms dealers and the gaming industry and tobacco and coal and, the parade of horribles from the Obama administration's perspective. It reached 30 different industries. And it was the weaponization of the financial industry by people who who found a really effective tool to try to force industries that they didn't like to go out of business. And the reason that it was so effective is because if you're a business in the United States and you don't have a bank account, you're out of business because the IRS requires you to remit your withholding taxes through electronic funds transfer, and you need a bank account to do that. So they found a really effective way to crack down on industries they didn't like.
Well, this is something that we've seen throughout like all kinds of different sectors. Like even if you look at what's happening with the Patreon purge and all of that, with Subscribestar, where you have content creators moving over there, then you had PayPal and Stripe pull entire services from the entire Subscribestar platform. You had Patreon, who first of all were being pressured by MasterCard, for example, and so they were just purging accounts. And then Patreon themselves, like you wonder how much of that force is coming from the payment providers who have such a stranglehold on the industry, because it's so difficult to become recognized as a payment provider. But really, like the monetary system in general, like if you control that, you can control everyone's actions. You can control what content YouTubers are putting out. You can control what art has been created and funded. You can control the sustainability of so many people's livelihoods. And what you're saying is that there was just systemic prejudice against whole industries, including marijuana. Like I know so many friends who had legal marijuana, like medical marijuana facilities in states where it was legal, and their accounts were just shut down because they, you had people who were pulling the strings of all of the payment processing and all the financial system who were able to pressure it. And I'd never actually known that was linked back to FDIC. And so let's explain why that was. Like the reasoning that they gave was that these industries are risky, right?
High risk.
And because they're an insurance provider. Right.
Yep. And it started with the Department of Justice with Eric Holder, former Attorney General. He was the one who started it. But what happened is it just expanded once the bullying bureaucrats, to be blunt, figured out that they had that power. They spread it far and wide. And President Trump ended the program in August of 2017. But there was just a letter that went out 3 months ago from 13 senators to the FDIC saying the after effects of this are still lingering and cut it out. That the culture of Operation Choke Point like regulatory actions has not concluded. Well, if you read, I did post an article in my tweet storm. If you read the article from I think he's a Missouri congressman who's leading the fight against this, and he said that the ombudsman at the FDIC, which is the place where you go if a bank loses its bank charter, that's the place where you appeal it. And the ombudsman at the FDIC was the guy who was the lead. He was the worst actor in Operation Choke Point, right? So, I mean, this is still going on. And when we heard testimony from the just dozens of legitimate startups in this industry, we're not talking about people who are money laundering. You know, that's all. Everybody, for better or for worse, everybody has to comply with anti-money laundering and know your customer rules. I've said publicly, I think a lot of that is unconstitutional. It's too far reaching, but it is the law of the land while it's still, you know, hasn't been deemed unconstitutional. So everybody's got to comply with that in order to get access to the payment system. But this is an entirely separate thing. This is bureaucrats who had the power to crack down on industries that they didn't deem politically correct. Yeah. And they did, and it was really effective. And Wyoming is pushing back. I will say, you mentioned the cannabis industry. That's not legal in Wyoming, not yet. So that this is not going to be a solution to the cannabis industry. That was one of the big questions we got because Colorado is just over the border. Right. You know, there are a lot of Colorado businesses who are looking for banking because they too have been shut down by the federal government. And they're, unfortunately, until it's legal at the federal level, they're not going to be able to get access to the payment system because the Fed's going to continue to block them. The business has to be legal at the federal level. But these 30 industries we're talking about, including blockchain, those were obviously legal businesses at the federal level. And yet they were basically, the fear of God was put into the banking industry, and the after effects of this are going to linger for decades.
So the actual bill that you guys passed. So, I mean, first of all, this is just going to create so much more freedom for people in terms of their choices, because, you know, if finally people have a choice. They were forced to go into this completely controlled system before. There was no alternative. And now we have alternative money, which immediately opens up people's choices. But then the bill that you guys have set up actually talks about institutions talk me through exactly what the bill is about.
So the bill is the most boring bank in the world. It's dollars only, but it can serve blockchain companies. It's not specific to blockchain companies. There are other industries that are going to step in, I think, and start these special purpose depository institutions as well. It's businesses only. It's not for retail consumers, and it's 100% reserve, no lending. So it's basically just a on and off ramp to the payment system. That's all it is.
Which is a necessity, as you said, because the government requires you to use the system for certain things. And if you don't have a bank account, that before was precluding you from having a business. But now this is an opportunity for people to still participate, to still have a business, and they're not going to be shut down because the FDIC has no say in this business because it's 100% reserve and they're not even involved.
Insured. That's exactly right. You've got it. The Fed is involved. So all the Bank Secrecy Act stuff, again, does still apply. You have to pass anti-money laundering and know your customer rules and the anti-terrorism analysis. That's a given. But what this is going to do is bring additional capital and additional alternatives. It's gotten to the point that in the blockchain industry that everybody has 2 or 3 bank accounts because you can't afford to take the risk of only banking in one place. Because if they close your account at the end of the year, I remember it was 2016, I believe, Morgan Stanley went through and did a big compliance audit in October of 2016 and closed thousands of bank accounts that people were using for legitimate digital asset businesses. And then there was this huge rush to go get a bank account opened at Silvergate. And Silvergate at the end of the year didn't have the capital to serve everybody and literally couldn't go through all the customer onboarding in enough time. And so there were several businesses, dozens of businesses who shut their doors at the end of 2016 after Morgan Stanley closed their bank accounts. And I don't mean to single out Morgan Stanley because they were not alone. And I also think there's a lot of anger towards the banks. And I won't defend the banks because I don't think they communicated this well. But what I'm laying out for you is it wasn't their choice. They had to defend their bank charter against the risk of losing it and then the higher cost of heightened regulatory supervision that was coming at them from the feds in Washington at the FDIC.
Yeah, it's amazing when these Yeah, when these leverage points start to become clear and you start to see the focal points of where all the pressure is coming from in the system, I mean, it's really quite fascinating and alarming. But what we are seeing is now a decentralization of all of that control, which is just
Yeah.
one of the best things that crypto has done. And those effects are just going to be so far reaching. So that allows, so basically, I mean, how would that work? So you have 100% reserve bank. So
Yep.
how would they, sorry, I sneeze. Oh.
Oh,
No, it's gone. It's gone. Almost sneezed.
yeah.
So how would they make their money there?
So they're going to be charging fees. So this is another interesting question. If you can get a regular bank account, you might get interest on your cash, and you're not going to have to pay as high a fee because the bank is, playing three-card Monte behind the scenes with your fractional reserve money, but they're, as a result, able to give you some interest on your cash.
So this is actually going back to the early days of what banks started out as, which was literally a vault for your
money
gold.
warehouse.
They would, you would pay a fee for them to securely store your gold, and they would give you like a paper IOU that you would say you can redeem this at any time. But then they started to have this fractional reserve business where they'd issue multiple IOUs for the same gold and all this. But really, this goes back to what banks used to be, which was a warehouse to store your money, and you would pay a fee for that service.
Yep. So I think most crypto businesses will end up, again, having 2 or 3 bank accounts, and this is the one that they know that they won't lose. And the others, they'll just constantly live in fear of having their bank accounts yanked, just like everybody does. Even the biggest companies in this industry live in fear of that. But there are a few banks who I really salute them. Silvergate, Metropolitan, Signature, Cross River, they're serving this industry and they're doing it well. But it's only a handful of banks that are doing that, and they can't serve the entire industry nationwide. Plus global, right? This is a global industry, and this banking issue, because of the far reach of U.S. banking regulations, it's a global issue of de-risking is the word that is bandied about, that the banks are de-risking their accounts and shutting down the bank accounts of customers they deem high risk that are going to potentially increase the regulatory scrutiny that the banks get. Well, Silvergate filed its what's called an S1 with the SEC a few months ago to go public. They're going to be doing an initial public offering to raise capital to serve this industry. And they showed that you can profitably bank this industry, but they also disclosed the enormous army of people they have on staff who handle the know your customer and anti-money laundering compliance for their customers. So it can be done, but it's a very different banking model than the traditional banks. And again, I was very careful not to criticize the local bankers for not wanting to bank this industry, because you've got to spend a lot of money on compliance in order to bank this industry, and you're going to get heightened regulatory scrutiny. It's a very rational decision for them not to bank this industry. Where we did have a disagreement was, the local bankers did not want a new bank coming in to bank it either, and that wasn't appropriate. So luckily, the wisdom of the Wyoming legislators is that they voted for it. This was a tighter vote. This was 20-10 in the Senate, and I will say this: every one of those 20, plus all the ones who voted for it in the House, are getting heat from their bankers back home. So I'm going to give a direct appeal to everyone in the blockchain industry: come to Wyoming, reward them for making a courageous decision like that. That was not an easy decision for any legislator, because they've got local constituents, their own bankers back home, telling them not to vote for this, and then they did. So that's the good Wyoming Cowboys. They have got some serious common sense, and they voted for it. But we've got to reward them. It's not enough to say, "Oh, great," and pat them on the back. We've got to get businesses to come to Wyoming.
Absolutely.
They can show their constituents that this was actually worthwhile.
That's such a great point, and it's really, really easy to incorporate something in Wyoming. A friend of mine tried it, and it literally took him 5 minutes reaching out to someone. Like, it was the easiest process in the world. And I presume once you're incorporated there, you're eligible for a bank account there. Is that correct?
Well, you still have to apply.
You have to apply. And
yeah.
some of these institutions, like this, doesn't go through until 2020, I believe. Is that right?
This particular bank, yeah, the first one we have to go through actually in both of the bank bills we just talked about, SF 125 and HB 74. There is a rules process. So SF 125, the digital asset custodians come first. They take effect July 1st. So we'll have rules put out for financial institutions, including, by the way, the special purpose depository institution. They can do this too, but they those rules will be out for public comment sometime in March, and then they take effect as of there's going to be a public hearing, a 45-day comment period, etc. Then that'll all take effect July 1st. And then the special purpose depository institution will come next. We'll probably get the rules out for that in May. I say we here because I'm going to be part of the advisory board to the banking commissioner to help draft the rules. This is not something that's ever been done before. We do have some precedent. So Bermuda, for example, has a digital asset custody handbook. So we actually can look at the rules they drafted and cut and paste a lot of that. I think that Bermuda did a good job with especially the technology rules that they published in December for digital asset custody. And I will say this, I've been critical of Bermuda. You'll see me talk a little bit about Bermuda in a little bit at the Satoshi Roundtable, the premier of Bermuda, who, as you know, was in attendance, recruiting businesses to come to Bermuda. Stay tuned, because I think there's some very interesting things that can happen between Wyoming and Bermuda with regard to financial technology sandboxes and a similar approach to digital asset custody that are trying to string together a regulatory approach that's going to check the boxes for North America and for Europe. And as we know, digital assets, this is a global business. And so if you can get two jurisdictions like that who can work together and help to make it possible for businesses to comply with regulations across wide swaths of the globe like that, there's real value in that. So stay tuned. We've been in conversations, and I'm hoping that something can transpire there with Bermuda.
Yeah, for sure. I'm always interested to see which jurisdictions around the world are really taking the lead in this. Bermuda's always been on my radar. I believe that he was also at Consensus this year, so I got to chat with him a little bit and talk about what's going on there. So there are lots of really interesting things happening all around the world. Honestly, I think Wyoming's the best thing that I've seen at the moment, because a lot of places around the world, you do have the government who there's a sort of rhetoric. Like I remember, hearing people speak in Puerto Rico. And I hope that becomes a hotbed for crypto. I don't see it currently, but I hope that it does. But the rhetoric you were hearing from government officials was, yes, we're very open-minded. We're watching. We're waiting to see what happens. We're definitely considering. And you got to think, like, this industry is moving so fast. You can't just be watching and waiting. You need to be taking action. Like, it's so new. You're not going to be seeing much going on. Like, you need to be the trailblazer, or like you'll be left behind. People are going to go to other places, like Bermuda, like Wyoming. But it is interesting to see in a lot of places it's sort of fueled from the regulators themselves, from the politicians. You have some people who might be crypto friendly, they get into power, they sort of spearhead this. But what's happened in Wyoming is you literally had this grassroots movement of volunteers who said, listen, this is my livelihood. This is what I do for a living. And I think this is the biggest step towards freedom that we've seen in a long time. I want to make sure that this has the best chance to succeed. Let's just dedicate our lives to this. And for that, I have to take my hat off and say a huge thank you to you, Caitlin Long, and your team at the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition, who've dedicated all of their time as volunteers, unpaid volunteers, putting all of this stuff together, because you made such an incredible difference here. And you really have set up just such a great foundation for people in this industry. If they want to incorporate, they now have a place where they can feel safe. They can feel like the people who are actually drafting these bills, who are actually writing the law, who are actually going over it with a fine-tooth comb. They're not just politicians who, happen to be interested in this. These are people in the industry who understand the tech, like inside out. They're very, very savvy. And you know that it's going to be done correctly. So huge thank you to you. I just have to say that, because it's just amazing to see what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. And I owe so many thanks to so many people. I want to clearly thank Steve Lupian, who also showed up, and Trace Mayer, who also volunteered a lot of his time. And he's not done. He's going to be helping us with the rules as an investor advocate, as part of the rules process. The legislative attorney who I alluded to earlier, he and I just geeked out over all this, and he's the unsung hero of all of this. And then there were folks who just kept showing up. Special shout out to Joe Pitluck and Amber Terrasas of Free Range Spaces. They are very interested in starting one of the special purpose depository institutions, and they just kept showing up. And it was just the three of us in the Senate chamber yesterday when the final vote came down on HB 74, the special purpose depository institution. And it was really nice to share a nice dinner with them and with the legislative attorney last night. The four of us got together. It's been a long road. They were joining the task force to testify about this as early as last spring. And Joe's story is very interesting. He's one who had a successful business shut down because he lost a bank account. So he's very motivated by fixing this for the industry. And, they'll be one of what I hope are many who apply for the special purpose depository institution. And I wish everyone well. You still got to go through a bureaucratic process to get the application in. And somebody on Twitter asked me today, what's the Kansas City Fed's view of this? The answer is we've had active conversations with the Kansas City Fed. And they actually gave us some feedback on the bill draft. They're not, of course, going to say that they're going to green light anything until they see an actual application in front of them. But we're pretty optimistic that they're not going to stand in the way. They're going to be granting what's called a master account, which is access to the Fed payment system, to applicants who are approved by the Wyoming Banking Commissioner. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us. Naomi, this is the first interview I've done.
Wow.
You caught me right away, right after.
I've been watching you. I mean, we chatted at the Satoshi Roundtable. You were just so happy. Like, you walked me through like what's going on there. And honestly, like so I'm someone I'm constantly keeping my ear to the ground with what's going on in terms of regulation all over the world, because I feel like it's my duty to provide information to people who I already have such an uphill battle, with user adoption, with all of these struggles, with this tech being very, difficult to build on. And there's so many obstacles to overcome. So regulatory obstacles on top of that. If there's a way that, we can give people information that lets them know where's easiest for them to set up. I think that that's so important. And so I've been following Wyoming for a long time, as you know, and I'm just so thrilled to see what's happening. And in my opinion, I think it's the best place for blockchain tech in the world right now, because of the work you guys are doing. And that's, it's just incredible what you're doing. Like there's a lot of talk around, there's a lot of people talking the talk, not walking the walk right now, in terms of talking about rhetoric, or we're going to pave the way, we're going to be the new blockchain center of the world, the new financial capital of the world. Wyoming is walking the walk, and it's absolutely incredible what you've done. It's just like orders of magnitude above what you're seeing elsewhere right now.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm down in Denver. I came down last night for ETH Denver, so I'm about to head over to the ETH Denver crowd, and there's a huge hackathon happening. It's one of the biggest Ethereum hackathons, and Andreas is here. I've never actually met Andreas. I'm so excited to hopefully shake his hand. Yeah, and Joe Lubin's here as well, and a lot of the folks who were actually very interested and instrumental in getting us to pass another bill that went through yesterday. I'll give a shout out to that, which authorizes tokens to act as stock certificates for securities token offerings. And that's a big deal too, because now Wyoming is the only place where you can do that. You could do uncertificated blockchain shares in both Delaware and Wyoming previously, but now Wyoming went that extra step and said you can do certificated blockchain shares as well in the state of Wyoming. So I know that particular bill, there are several dozen startups that are looking to do their security token offerings in certificated form, and so they're the only place where that's going to be authorized is Wyoming. So we're going to see.
There are like 6 bills at the moment. We've really only talked about 3 of them. There are other things as well. I do have a question from Zaphoid, who's currently over in Acapulco having a wonderful time. But he sends a question on Bitbacker. Thank you so much, Chris, for using Bitbacker. I really appreciate that, sending your question. And he sent $5 $5 in smart cash and asks what advantages are there for individuals who work in the crypto industry and earn crypto income to move to Wyoming? So what's the incentive for the individual there?
Well, it is still subject to federal taxation. So that's the one drawback, is that federal, the taxes in the United States vis-a-vis crypto are a bit of a mess, because you've got to pay capital gains and keep track of your capital gains and losses on crypto. But in the state of Wyoming, there is no income tax and there is no tax on crypto. We've exempted, last year in the bills that passed, there was a bill that exempted crypto from property taxes. So it also, I found out this year, is exempt from sales tax as well. So you're just not going to pay taxes on crypto in the state of Wyoming. Of course, I can't give tax advice, but go read the statutes. You'll draw those conclusions. And Wyoming is by far the tax friendliest state for crypto in the United States. Again, unfortunately, we can't fix the federal issues. Just working on the state stuff first. But the state stuff is pretty darn important. So
absolutely, and it's a catalyst for what's to come, right? You saw what happened in the marijuana industry, where you started off with just one place having the gall to stand up to the federal government and say, actually, we're going to go against federal law as a state law. It's legal here for medical purposes, for recreation purposes, whatever. And from there, you saw it steamroll. You saw more and more states start to explore this, and now it seems like that it's definitely tipped that we could be looking very soon to federal law being changed about this.
And oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just so excited to see that happening, because it really does start with the states, and it starts with them setting a precedent and an example and showing, what this would look like, a test case, you could say. More and more people jump on board, and that's what's going to happen in crypto. You're going to have wonderful places like Wyoming who have the nerve to stand up and say, hey, we're just going to go out and set up this wonderful law here, and other states who see the influx of businesses. And honestly, I already know so many people who have set up in Wyoming after all of this has been going through. So I think that once nearby states especially see what's going on there, the influx of customers and revenue and all of this, then I think that they're going to jump on board as well.
Yeah, and it's happening. The utility token bill that Wyoming passed last year that said that a consumptive utility token is not a security, that was copied in Arizona. It's now being copied in 6 other states. So it's already happening that states are copying the Wyoming legislation. And I would definitely encourage every listener who lives in the United States to reach out to their congressmen or senators locally, not the US ones, the local state ones, and encourage them to adopt the Wyoming utility token bill, because it's exactly your point, Naomi. There's so much that happens at the states that ends up forcing the federal action. And also the Wyoming SF 125 with regard to how digital assets are treated as property and under the Uniform Commercial Code. We don't want the alternative proposal, which has been proposed in Hawaii and Oklahoma so far. If you live in Hawaii and Oklahoma, definitely write your congressman and encourage them not to vote for the alternative proposal. Definitely encourage them to instead vote for the Wyoming proposal, because you want direct ownership of these assets to be recognized by the law.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, I mean, do we want to quickly just recap some little things about the remaining 3 bills we haven't yet talked about?
Sure. Well, a couple of them are really minor. Like, one is it applies the same laws that we wrote last year for non-bank corporations to be able to keep books and records on a blockchain. Now banks can do that. So, that's kind of a minor bill. The financial technology sandbox, though, is a big deal too, because that is one that allows for 2 years with the potential to extend to a 3rd year. If there's some innovation that you have that is not going to harm consumers, then you can apply to have an exemption from all financial regulation, except for the Bank Secrecy Act that I alluded to earlier is not avoidable. But I'm talking about the state regulation. And you can be in what's called the sandbox for 2 years with the extension option to extend it.
That's pretty significant there.
It's very significant. It's very significant. And I wish we'd had that in place. The whole Wyoming blockchain thing got started when I discovered there was a big problem with Wyoming's money transmitter law when I tried to donate Bitcoin to the University of Wyoming to fund an endowment for female engineers. And they couldn't take it because of Wyoming's bad money transmitter law. And I said, well, we got to go fix that. And then the snowball just picked up a lot more snow as it was rolling down the hill. And here we are. But yeah, I wish we'd had the financial technology sandbox at that time, because Coinbase pulled out of Wyoming and stranded a lot of people's coins.
Why did Coinbase do that?
Because they didn't want to apply for the money transmitter law license in Wyoming.
Wow.
At the time. So, and I don't blame them. It was one of those, it was the early days of crypto in 2014 when they came in, and they probably didn't have, a big legal team at the time. And then they were told, hey, what you're doing is illegal. You got to get out of the state, or you've got to apply for a money transmitter license. And instead, what we did is we came in and said, no, let's just exempt all that from the money transmitter license, and now they're back. But had the Fintech sandbox been in place, they wouldn't have had to have pulled out, because the banking commissioner could have said, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put you in the Fintech sandbox for 2 years. So you're allowed to stay, but now you have to, make sure you're not harming consumers. So yeah. This is really important, because it does actually roll back regulation for 2 years, as long as you can prove you're not harming consumers. That's a big one as well. And there's reciprocity with other states that have Fintech sandboxes, and other countries like Bermuda, I was talking about earlier, that also have Fintech sandboxes. So we can weave exemption from financial regulation across both North America and Europe with putting together some of these regulatory regimes that are trying to help facilitate innovation instead of crack down on it and block it.
Absolutely. So, that's one of the things that was so devastating about New York, is that there was no safe harbor. There was no sandbox, and it really just killed innovation there. Everyone left immediately. Kraken, pulled out immediately. Shapeshift pulled out, because it wasn't feasible for these tiny startups, when the crypto market was so small, to be paying these exorbitant compliance fees. They're scraping by. The whole point of a lot of these companies was to try and bring down fees as much as possible, and to provide an alternative to traditional finance, where the fees were just through the roof, because again, compliance was crazy. So you have a tiny startup that has to go through all these astronomical compliance costs. Basically, what you've done is that you've set it up so that the only people who can enter the space are existing financial firms who have the the margins to be able to cover these expenses, who have the economies of scale, who are so large that they're able to cover all of this, because they're already established. And so it precludes, that's a huge barrier to entry for small businesses to come in, and makes it a very unlevel playing field there. So it's just so wonderful to see Wyoming taking the opposite approach, being the antithesis to New York, where they're like, listen, you don't have to be an entrenched financial institution to participate. You can be a fintech startup, and we will give you some sort of leniency there to get your business going. I just think that's wonderful to see.
Well, but it's more than that. And I'm so glad that you highlighted the New York versus Wyoming fault line, because it's even bigger than that. New York allows rehypothecation and failure to deliver and naked shorting, all these bad practices that happen on Wall Street that pick mom and pop's pocket. They're legal in New York. There's a reason why John Corzine didn't go to jail, because what he did wasn't illegal. There's a reason why no one was prosecuted in the Lehman Brothers failure or the Bear Stearns failure, because what they did wasn't illegal. Well, how's that possible? Most of us scratch our heads and say, this is crazy. How come there wasn't criminal liability for the collapse of these big financial institutions and what most of us would consider outright theft from people's livelihood? And the answer is because in New York, it's legal. It is not legal in Wyoming. And I love the fact that Utah and Colorado are also looking at following Wyoming's lead on some of these things. We're going to end up with a Rocky Mountain-based property rights defending financial regime that is going to suck assets away from New York. And as more and more assets are issued on a blockchain, especially securities, I think in the next 10 years, there's just going to be a mass migration issuing securities away from issuing securities in their analog form, which is literally a piece of paper, over to a blockchain form. Most folks don't realize securities are still issued in paper form. There's something called a global security sitting in the vault at the Depository Trust Company in New York. And what we own against that global security is what's called a security entitlement. That's digitized, but the ultimate security itself is still a piece of paper sitting in depository trust company's vault in New York. If you don't believe me, go read the stories about the flooding of that vault during Hurricane Sandy. Most of those pieces of paper were destroyed and had to be replaced. And it took a year or two for the depository trust company to go back and replace those pieces of paper. This is still how this is done. And those layers of intermediaries create all those problems. But the big takeaway is Wyoming is actually standing for solvent financial institutions, for direct property rights in your assets. It's more than just the not having bullying financial regulation. It's much more fundamental than that. It is, we do not want bad actors who are going to play three-card Monte with assets into the state of Wyoming. We did restrict the ability to rehypothecate assets because it is a crime in Wyoming, and so you can't do that if you're going to come into the state of Wyoming. You can't. And there was one big player in this industry who I won't name, who gave us feedback on that and asked us, why would we bother restricting that? We're making so much money at it. And this is for digital assets. Yes, that is not a solvent institution. And
Wow.
At some point, unfortunately, their customers are going to figure that out.
Wow.
But I do not want assets like that in Wyoming, institutions like that in Wyoming. And they won't be able to comply because they don't believe in direct property rights.
That's incredible. Like, that's what I really dislike. I mean, I love the fact that you have this experiment across states. You have New York who's trying things, and then now you have Wyoming who's trying very different things. People can vote with their feet. They can choose, like, do I want to have my money in a place where I know it's going to be there for me to collect at any time that I want it, or no, it may not be there. They may not have it. They may not be solvent. And that does worry me about crypto at the moment, that a lot of people probably just presume, like, oh, this is a new industry, that my stuff's probably there. Like, they probably haven't wrapped their head around the fact that a lot of these big probably playing all the same games that traditional finance is playing.
Absolutely,
and your money is not safe. Like, January 3rd was a big test to this. Trace Mayer starting off this proof of keys concept, which I thought was a great idea. And again, like, if you want to put your money in an exchange and where they are doing fractional reserve banking and all that, I think you should totally have the choice to do this if you really want to, but it should be clear that that is what's happening. Otherwise, I think people are being misled, and it's fraudulent activity for them to be saying we're storing your money when actually they're not. They're actually just lending it out 10 times over. So I think that like transparency is key, and if we see people start to move to Wyoming and using their business model, their laws, their regulatory guidance, instead of opting to go to institutions in New York, which have very different structure there, then the market will start to dictate like what people want. Maybe they do want security. Maybe they do want their money to still be there. People are saying that there's an impending crash coming. Krugman was even suggesting that it could happen this year. He said it's very likely that we could see some sort of recession that's far worse than the previous recession. So if that sort of stuff happens, do you think your crypto assets is really going to be safe either, unless you actually hold it yourself? People should be like rethinking why they got into crypto, how they're storing it, revisiting their security practices, because if you are doing this to safeguard yourself or as a hedge or anything, then you're not doing it properly if you're still playing into these same problematic financial structures.
Totally right. That's totally right. Yeah, great summary of it all. And it's just going to be fun to watch in the next decade, the assets that are going to move with their feet into Wyoming and out of New York.
And that's because of you, Caitlin. I mean, honestly, I can't thank you enough.
Oh, thank you. It's truly the wise, common sense Wyoming legislators who just made the decision with their gut in a lot of cases. And there were a number of people who came at us. I'll share some of the story of the folks who really wanted us not to recognize direct property rights in digital assets and wanted us to force it into that indirect ownership regime. They came at us pretty hard, and we touched a nerve clearly by going in a different direction. And, when I explained it to the Wyoming legislators, they all just got it immediately. Like, why would you want to try to force these assets into securities intermediaries? That makes zero sense. And I love how common sense everybody is in Wyoming.
It's wonderfully refreshing, isn't it, to see that? It's Goodness me. Well, I mean, I've been really appreciative of your time today, Caitlin. As you said, this is the first interview that you've done talking
Yes.
about all this amazing work. I've been following your Twitter. Like I'm looking every time you make an update, just like, oh, what's happening now? Because I know that there is so much in the works at the moment that you are working so hard on. Your team is working so hard, and the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition has just does such tremendous work. Can people support you somewhere? Do you accept donations to help like fund what you're doing?
No, thank you. I must say I thank Satoshi because I'm able to do this thanks to Satoshi. And so we don't have a formal organization in Wyoming. What I would much prefer is that you actually, instead of donating, just go to your own local legislators and get them to enact SF 125. They can copy it, just duplicate it, and also enact the utility token legislation from last year. Let's get more than just 6 states that are going to copy that, so that we can force the feds into recognizing that not everything is in this industry is a security, and we can counteract the move to try to get digital assets to be forced into the security intermediary regime. So the utility token bill and SF 125, those are the 2 critical ones to go get enacted in your own states. I'd much rather, instead of taking donations, just go do this in your own states. Let's get critical mass of states moving in this same direction.
Absolutely. And I'm surprised that, like, for example, the Free State hasn't already gone in this direction. Like, these are things that people need to be picking up the mantle themselves. They need to be going out. It's all about individual responsibility, not presuming that there's a Caitlin Long in every state. Maybe you guys could be the Caitlin Long in your state. So here's my call to action for everyone in this chat. If you are not a Caitlin Long, then perhaps you know of a Caitlin Long. Perhaps you can support them. Perhaps you can be there, you know, making sure that these things go forward, because Caitlin, what you've done is incredible, and I think it really is going to change the face of crypto in America. So huge thank you to you. Huge thank you to everyone who's in the chat, who's joined us on this Saturday morning. I really appreciate you being here. Huge thank you to Zapboid for sending through the power chat in Bitbacker. I really appreciate everyone who's been using Bitbacker. I just really love seeing you guys there, and it's always so helpful to keep this channel going. So that's all for this morning. Caitlin, I just feel like this ending, I don't want to leave, because I'm just like, I just need to tell her how appreciative I am. But let's call it a day there, but let's check back in, because I know there's going to be more news to come, constantly exciting things. So we'll check back in soon. And for now, just a thank you from me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And for those of you who are going to be at ETH Denver, I'll look forward to seeing you this afternoon. Take care, everyone.
Absolutely. See you, everyone.